Some truths were never meant to be spoken aloud. Truths that bleed through photographs, whispered in the crack of an old cabin door. Truths that rot beneath the soil of forgotten hollows. Tonight, one of those secrets is opening itself to you. A family buried in history's shadows, hidden behind the silence of the Appalachian Mountains, and erased from official memory for reasons far more sinister than simple neglect. Welcome to Fear Liturgy, the place where buried truths refuse to stay dead. It begins in the winter of 1887, when a single photograph arrived at the Charleston courthouse. At first glance, it was just another faded image of mountain life children gathered outside a log home, snow piled thick around their bare feet. But stare too long, and the details claw at your mind. 17 children. Some no older than 3. Their ribs pressing against skin, their eyes sunken, hollow, ancient in their despair, and around their ankles chains. Heavy iron shackles, stark against the white snow. Shackles that no child should ever wear. What made this image even darker was not just the suffering frozen in time, but the records. Court ledgers, census rolls, church books all claimed the Greylock family of Bone Creek Hollow had only 4 children. 4, the other 13. Erased. Paperwork denied their existence. The community insisted they never lived. The silence of neighbors and the absence of records fused together like stone walls, designed to bury the truth alive. But photographs don't lie. That single plate, developed in the darkroom of a nervous photographer, cracked open a story that the mountains themselves had conspired to keep hidden. Who were those children? Where had they come from? And how could an entire community conspire to act as though they never breathed? Bone Creek Hollow was not just a valley. It was a fortress of silence, a kingdom built by a patriarch who understood that in isolation power grows unchecked. The Greylocks were not simple farmers. They were architects of control, masters of disappearance, and perhaps the cruelest family the Appalachian Mountains ever concealed. And tonight, you will follow me into their hollow. But be warned, once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. And once you hear what happened there, you will never look at those mountains the same way again. Bone Creek Hollow. Even the name carries weight. Locals used to say, the valley itself swallowed sound. A place where screams echoed only long enough to die against the stone ridges, where travelers vanished into fog, and the earth gave nothing back. In 1887, this wasn't just remote, it was exile. A pocket of America sealed off by terrain and winter, carved out by families who believed isolation was the only way to keep control of their bloodlines, their land, and their secrets. The Greylock family weren't the first settlers to walk those trails, but they were the ones who never left. Jeremiah Greylock, the patriarch, led his kin through the Cumberland Gap in 1834, not searching for fortune in gold or fertile plains like other pioneers, but for something else. He craved separation. He understood what isolation could give a man. Freedom from oversight. Freedom from law. Freedom from God's watchful neighbors. He found a valley rich with water, timber, and game. And there he planted the roots of a dynasty that would grow far darker than anyone could have predicted. By the time his grandson, Ezekiel, inherited the hollow, the family's philosophy had hardened into something colder than the Appalachian winters. Ezekiel Greylock was tall, lean, and deceptively humble in appearance, but his mind was sharp as broken glass. He cultivated the image of a simple mountain man, patched clothes, slow dialect, soft eyes, but beneath that mask burned a calculating intelligence. The kind that measures human lives not by value but by utility. To Ezekiel, children were not blessings. They were resources. And resources existed to be controlled. Here was the cruel genius. In a world where record-keeping was fragile, where churches held more sway than courthouses, where children disappeared into apprenticeships and adoptions with little question, Ezekiel found the perfect blind spot. A system where you could erase a child on paper simply by refusing to acknowledge he ever existed. No birth record. No baptism. No census entry. No problem. And if no one in the hollow spoke their names, then as far as the outside world was concerned, they never were. Think about that for a moment. Imagine living in a world where your existence is held together only by the words of others, where silence alone can kill your name, your history, your proof of ever being alive. That was the trap the Greylocks perfected. And those shackled children in the photograph? They were only the ones caught in the open. The real question, the one investigators feared to ask, was how many others never even made it to the camera's eye. Ezekiel Greylock understood something most men never dare admit. Control is not about force, it's about belief. Chains are only effective when the mind accepts them. And in Bone Creek Hollow, Ezekiel forged an empire, not with armies or laws, but with silence, dependency, and fear so carefully constructed that it looked like tradition. Outsiders saw a hard-working mountain patriarch. Insiders saw something closer to a warden. The family's cruelty wasn't random. It was systematic. Every child who crossed into that valley was stripped of their past like an animal skinned for its hide. Names were changed, stories erased, histories dissolved. A boy from a mining town might suddenly become a distant cousin. A girl left at a church door might reappear as a ward of the family. No one asked questions, because questions were dangerous in the hollow. And once silence became a habit, it became law. The Greylocks turned isolation into a weapon. By controlling every road in and out of the valley, by owning the land that surrounded Bone Creek, they made escape nearly impossible. Even when a child dared to run, where could they go? Miles of forest. No money, no allies. And if the weather didn't kill them, hunger would. The mountains themselves became part of Ezekiel's design, a natural prison wall that needed no guards. But here's what makes their story so disturbing. The Greylocks were not alone. They built their empire on the complicity of neighbors, preachers, even officials. Families in nearby hollows, crushed by famine or desperate after mining accidents, would hand over their children with the faint hope of survival. They told themselves it was charity. They convinced themselves the Greylocks were helping. And so the cycle fed itself. Desperate parents gave, corrupt men took. And Ezekiel's household swelled with silent faces that no one would ever count. Think about the psychology here. A community learns to survive by ignoring what's in plain sight. A child disappears, they've moved on. Shackles clink in the night. Just farm tools. 17 skeletal children in a snowbound yard? Call it an accident, a trick of the lens. When lies are easier than truth, lies become reality. And Ezekiel Greylock ruled in that reality like a king whose subjects had all chosen blindness. His power didn't come from brutality alone. It came from the terrifying fact that everyone else found it easier to pretend he was right. In December of 1887, fate carried a stranger into Bone Creek Hollow. His name was Henry Petton, a traveling photographer, an ordinary man with an extraordinary tool. At a time when most mountain families would live and die without ever being photographed, Petton offered portraits for 50 cents. To city folk, that was nothing. But to the hollows, it was an immortality few could afford. And Ezekiel Greylock, always eager to display the mask of respectability, welcomed him in. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The homestead rose like a fortress of timber and stone, more prosperous than any farm within miles. Ezekiel introduced his 4 official children, polished and disciplined, each one rehearsed like actors on a stage. Petton set up his equipment, impressed but unsuspecting. But then, he noticed shadows. Children darting between buildings, their clothes torn, their movements furtive. Faces that vanished when he looked too closely. They weren't part of the picture Ezekiel wanted shown. When Petton asked, Ezekiel's answers slid off the tongue like oil. Distant relatives, orphans taken in through charity, hired hands. All perfectly normal in these mountains, where bloodlines tangled and wards were common. It was a story meant to pacify a stranger who didn't know better. But as Petton prepared the family portrait, the truth tore through the facade like a crack in glass. From one of the outbuildings came chaos, shouts, rattling chains. The the panicked scramble of small feet on frozen earth. And then they appeared. Children, dozens of them, burst into the courtyard, pale and skeletal, their eyes wide with terror. Around their ankles, unmistakable in the winter light, hung iron shackles linked with chain. Not the tools of apprentices, not the garb of cousins, but instruments of captivity. The mask dropped. Martha Greylock's voice cut the air like a blade, shrieking commands with the fury of a lifetime of cruelty. Samuel and Rebecca, the elder children, moved with precision, rounding up escapees. Leather straps in hand, practiced in their violence. And Ezekiel himself? His soft smile vanished, replaced with the raw face of a ruler unmasked, barking orders with cold authority. In that chaos, the truth was visible for the first time, and Henry Petton, hands trembling, did the unthinkable. His camera was already primed, the shutter waiting. Almost by instinct, he captured the scene. 17 children, barefoot in the snow, shackles glinting like scars of iron, their eyes pleading with the silent lens. In that instant, the Greylock's kingdom of silence was pierced by something they could not control. Evidence. A single frozen moment that carried the weight of all their crimes. That night, Henry Petton could barely breathe. His hands shook as he packed his camera, hiding the fragile glass plate that now carried the faces of 17 shackled children. Ezekiel demanded the image, convinced the exposure had failed, but Petton lied. He feigned error, promised a retake, and in that deception, carried the most dangerous truth he would ever hold. By the time he left Bone Creek Hollow, his mind burned with questions and his chest tightened with dread. He had seen something no outsider was meant to see. And worse, he had recorded it. For 3 nights in his Charleston hotel room, he hesitated to even develop the plate. Each time he closed his eyes, the faces returned, their hollow eyes staring through him, demanding justice he wasn't sure he could give. When the image finally emerged in the chemical bath, he almost collapsed. It was worse than memory. The camera had captured not just shackles and skeletal frames, but the raw terror etched into every child's face. A truth so unbearable that silence seemed safer than speaking it aloud. But in 1887, who would believe him? These were not days of child protection laws or investigative journalists. Child labor was normal. Apprenticeships blurred the line between charity and slavery. And Ezekiel Greylock wasn't some outlaw hiding in the woods. He was respected, feared, connected. His name carried weight in courtrooms. His coin kept churches open. His crops filled the markets in Cedar Ridge. To accuse him would mean to accuse an entire system that had already decided not to see. Petton began to ask quiet questions, but the answers only deepened the nightmare. A sheriff who waved him off, eyes darting with unspoken knowledge. Judges who had signed dozens of child placement papers, all connected to the Greylocks, yet none of those children could be traced. Preachers who praised Ezekiel's charity, never questioning why so many orphans ended up in his hollow. Everywhere Petton turned, he found not disbelief, but complicity. The Greylocks had built a kingdom of silence, and its borders extended far beyond the mountains. Imagine the weight of that realization. You are one man, holding a photograph that proves the existence of a hidden world. But every authority, every institution, every neighbor has chosen blindness. To act is to risk ruin. To stay silent is to betray the children who stare at you from the paper. That is where Petton lived, in a purgatory between truth and destruction. Caught in the crosshairs of a system designed to devour anyone who spoke against it. And that was the Greylock's greatest weapon. Not the chains on the children's ankles, but the invisible chains that bound every adult who knew and chose silence. By the spring of 1888, Henry Petton understood the full weight of what he had stumbled into. The Greylocks were not just one cruel family, they were the heart of a system that had been operating for decades, maybe longer. A network of judges, clerks, preachers, neighbors, now feeding children into a machine that erased their names and consumed their bodies. And behind it all was Ezekiel Greylock, a man who had turned isolation into an industry of silence. The world believed in law and order, but here in the hollow, law was whatever Ezekiel said it was. Pettin's investigation revealed the pattern. Records showed dozens of children placed with the Greylocks over 15 years. Yet, when he traced their names, nothing. No graves, no marriages, no census entries, no descendants. It was as though they had been swallowed whole by the mountain itself. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized silence wasn't neglect. It was policy. Everyone who could have spoken chose not to, because not speaking was safer than breaking the spell. Fear became loyalty. Complicity became survival. And here's the part. Most men watching this will feel deep in their bones. This isn't just history. This is the blueprint of control. The Greylocks may be gone, but the system they perfected is everywhere. Governments, corporations, institutions, they erase what they don't want you to see. And the rest of us, out of fear or comfort or convenience, pretend not to notice. We let it happen, just like the Hollow did. But tonight, you are not just a spectator. If you've followed me this far, if you've heard these words and felt that tightening in your chest, then you already know you're being pulled deeper than you intended. And I'm going to ask you to prove it. Right now in the comments, write this phrase 2 times, I see the chains. Type it twice. Not once, twice. Because the first time is acknowledgement. The second time is transformation. That act will lock in what you've already felt stirring, that you are no longer blind. That you refuse to play the game of silence. Understand this. Henry Pettin's photograph didn't just expose one family. It revealed a pattern of how power survives. By silencing the weak. By rewarding the loyal. By burying the inconvenient. Once you see that truth, you cannot unsee it. And if you have the courage to speak those words in the comments, you join a lineage of men who choose to see, even when others look away. And from this point forward, the descent only gets darker. Henry Pettin didn't just capture a photograph, he cracked a doorway. And once a doorway opens, you can't choose what steps through. In the months that followed, whispers about Bone Creek Hollow spread, carried in coded letters, in barroom rumors. In church confessions quickly silenced. And each time the same pattern emerged, the story would rise. The story would be crushed, and silence would return thicker than before. This wasn't chaos. This was design. Ask yourself this. How do dark systems survive century after century? How can crimes so large remain invisible? The answer is not violence. The answer is repetition. Ezekiel Greylock had discovered what the most powerful men in history already knew: control isn't about hiding the truth. It's about flooding people with so many lies, so many half-truths, so many comfortable distractions, that the truth rots in plain sight. When neighbors heard chains, they told themselves it was farm tools. When they saw frightened children, they told themselves it was charity. And when Pettin revealed a photograph that made denial impossible, the system's instinct was simple. Erase him, not the crime. Here's the part no one likes to admit. Bone Creek Hollow was not unique. Across America, in the late 1800s, charitable placements were vanishing children by the thousands. Some were funneled into factories. Some disappeared into the mansions of men whose names history still praises. And some ended up in hollows like Ezekiel's, where records went dark and silence consumed them. What Pettin had stumbled onto wasn't an isolated nightmare. It was a fragment of a blueprint so large, it still haunts the structures of power today. And men, listen closely here. This is where the rabbit hole turns inward. Because systems like this only work when ordinary people choose comfort over truth. The Greylocks survived not because they were invisible, but because everyone around them decided it was easier not to see. That's the same instinct in governments that bury scandals, corporations that vanish whistleblowers, and even families that hide their own sins. Silence is the oldest currency of power, and it is always paid in the lives of the vulnerable. Pettin's photograph was supposed to be a mirror. It asked the community, will you see? Or will you remain blind? and history answered with cowardice. The picture was buried. The story was suppressed, and the Greylocks carried on, because the silence of the many is always more powerful than the screams of the few. The moment Henry Pitton developed that photograph, his fate was sealed. Truth, once captured, doesn't just sit quietly. It demands to be seen. But the Greylocks understood something darker. If you cannot erase the evidence, erase the man who carries it. And almost overnight, the weight of silence turned against him. It began subtly. Clients canceled their portrait sessions. His letters went unanswered. Lodging houses suddenly had no vacancy when he arrived. Strangers followed him through train stations, their faces blank, their questions too practiced. Every attempt to publish the photograph was met with polite rejections that carried the stench of fear. Editors who had once begged for content now warned him to let it go, to move on, to forget what he'd seen. Forgetting was safer. But the pressure didn't stop at isolation. One night, in a boarding house in Knoxville, he returned to his rented room to find the glass plate shattered on the floor. Not stolen, destroyed. His proof reduced to shards, as though someone wanted him to understand. The Greylocks could reach him anywhere. And yet, they didn't kill him. Not immediately. That was their genius. Killing makes martyrs. Discrediting makes ghosts. So the whispers began. Pitton was unstable, they said. He drank too much. He hallucinated. He invented wild stories to sell his photographs. Within months, his reputation dissolved. Men who once shook his hand now crossed the street. Even family distanced themselves, repeating lies they half believed. In an era when a man's word was his currency, Pitton had been bankrupted. Not by bullets, not by poison, but by silence sharpened into slander. Think about that, because this is how systems always win. They don't need to destroy the body if they can kill the voice. And once the voice is gone, the truth dies quietly beside it. How many modern whistleblowers, journalists, soldiers, workers have you seen follow the same path? First, ignored, then ridiculed, then erased. Different century, same playbook. The Greylocks were just a rural rehearsal of a pattern that now stretches across boardrooms, capitals, and newsrooms. Pitton lived the rest of his life as a man haunted. A photographer who had captured an image too dangerous for his time. A man who walked with the knowledge that he had seen the chains, while everyone else chose to remain blind. And when he died in 1901, alone and forgotten, the world buried him without the faintest clue of the secret he carried. His photograph, shattered glass in a forgotten boarding house, was the silence's final victory. The Greylocks of Bone Creek Hollow were never just a family. They were a blueprint, a prototype of control. Look closely at how they operated. Isolation, silence, manipulation of records, control of children, and the erasure of dissent. These are not the tools of some backwoods clan. They are the tools of empires, governments, corporations. The Mountain Hollow was their stage, but the script was ancient. Consider this. Every corrupt institution in history has thrived by creating its own Bone Creek Hollow, a place where outsiders never look too closely, where official numbers never match reality, where the suffering is hidden in plain sight, but wrapped in the illusion of charity and order. Whether it was the orphan trains that scattered children across America, the sweatshops buried in city basements, or the modern-day systems that hide forced labor behind glossy branding, the Greylocks were not unique. They were simply honest about their cruelty, while the rest of the world mastered the art of denial. And this is the part most men cannot face. You live in a world built on Greylock logic. A world where your labor is taken, your spirit shackled, your will bent not with chains on your ankles, but with contracts, debts, screens, and promises of safety. The Greylocks chained flesh. Today's powers chain the mind. Which prison is harder to escape? Which leaves fewer marks? That is why you were never meant to hear this story. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the Greylock signature, the calculated silences, the erased records, the manipulated symbols, you will start to see it everywhere. in politics, in media, in religion, in corporations. And once you see it, the illusion breaks. The world no longer feels safe because you realize safety was the illusion all along. Men who wake up to this truth have two choices: retreat into comfortable blindness or step forward into the fire of awareness. One path keeps you chained. The other burns, but it burns away the lies. So now, as you're listening, I want you to anchor this awakening inside yourself. Write it in the comments right now, twice. No hollow holds me. That phrase is your key, your mark of resistance. Because every man who speaks it declares that he will not be buried in someone else's silence, that he sees the pattern, that he refuses the Greylock's grip. And understand this: the Greylocks were destroyed not by laws, not by courts, but by one man who dared to see and dared to speak, even when it cost him everything. That is the real power. They never wanted you to inherit the power to refuse their silence, to refuse their illusion, and to walk out of the hollow with your eyes open. The Greylocks are gone. Bone Creek Hollow has collapsed back into silence, the cabins rotting, the records buried under dust. But the lesson they left behind has not died. It has only changed its mask. For the cruelest families were never just individuals in the mountains. They were reflections of a larger truth. Power feeds on obedience, and darkness thrives wherever men refuse to see. So what do you do with this knowledge? You carry it. You sharpen it. You wield it. Because once you've heard this story, you are no longer the same man you were before. You cannot pretend ignorance. You cannot unhear the chains rattling in the snow. And whether you realize it or not, you now walk a different path, the path of those who see through the smoke, who hear the whispers, who recognize the hidden structures that hold the world together by keeping men divided, distracted, and docile. The Greylocks are not history. They are a symbol, a shadow in every government office, every boardroom, every pulpit where silence is traded for obedience. But here's the truth: they never wanted you to understand. Their power ends the moment you name it. The moment you refuse their silence, the moment you step out of the hollow. That is why men like you are dangerous, not because you carry weapons, but because you carry sight. Now, if you've stayed with me through this descent, you are already different from most. But don't stop here. This brotherhood of awareness grows only when men like you spread it. Leave your mark by writing in the comments again, "No hollow holds me." Twice. Seal it. Claim it. Make it echo. Because every time those words appear, another man wakes up. Another illusion breaks. Another chain shatters. And when you're ready to keep descending into forbidden truths, stories history buried, secrets that still whisper in the dark, make sure you join us here, inside the circle. Subscribe to Fear Liturgy and turn on the bell, because what comes next will take you even deeper. But be warned, once you enter, there is no way back to the comfort of ignorance. The Greylocks taught us one truth worth remembering: the real prisons are built of silence. Break the silence, and you break the chains. The story of Bone Creek Hollow is over, but your descent has only just begun.